All right, so hey, folks, tonight I wanted to talk to you about free speech. I've been thinking about this issue a lot lately. How could free speech be an issue? Well, I mean, I think anybody who's lived in America in the past 20 years can probably see how it's an issue. But I want to talk to you about some very specific things, and this is what I have formulated in my mind. Probably nothing that I'm going to say is an original thought. Um, it's simply synthesis from all the things that I've read and heard and learned over the years. But I thought about this fairly deeply over the past couple of days. And so I'm going to lay it out there. Free speech, well, let me say it this way. Speech is central to being a human being. Free speech is fundamental to being a free human and a sovereign individual. So let's start at the very beginning. So Genesis tells us that God spoke the universe into existence. He made mankind in his image, and then he breathed life into him. And then later on in the story, he actually had man name the animals and name the stuff in the earth. He even allowed Adam to name his wife, to name what she was. Woman, says, because she came from man. And he's using his speech to doing these things. We are the only beings on the planet that have speech, that can talk to one another. So speech from the very earliest writings that we have, speech is central to being a human being. And I'll go on further to say that we create the world that we live in. Now, this is my opinion. This is my, like I said, synthesis of a lot of things that I've learned over the years. But we create the world that we live in. And in my view, it's a muted imitation of the creator. So think about this. Hear me out. Think about relationships that are formed, nurtured, or destroyed through speech. You want to destroy a relationship? You can damn sure do it through speech. If you want to repair a relationship, you're probably going to have to use speech. You're going to have to use the right kind of speech, not the wrong kind of speech. Think about how you speak to your husband or how you speak to your wife or your children. What are you doing with your speech? You're going to either be hurting them, or you're going to be helping them. Are you nurturing the relationship, or are you destroying the relationship? So speech is a very, very powerful thing, just in that one small instance of relationships. But then think about all the relationships that you build around you. Think about all your family relationships, all your friend relationships, and how we manage those largely through speaking. We can communicate hate. We can communicate love. We can speak properly to the people around us, or we can speak roughly and nastily to the people around us. And through that, we create, in a very literal sense, the world that we live in. Now, I'll go a little bit further to say that we set goals, and we often achieve or fail through what we say or what we write. In speech, I'm including the written word. So I'm going to take another leap here. So stick with me. That speech is synonymous with thought. So think about that. And as you're thinking about it, are you thinking about it in words? You're using language, right? So I'm going to state that speech is synonymous with thought. I know that for myself personally, a very large portion of what I think, of the ideas I formulate, of the plans I make, they're in speech, in my head, my internal voice, and I talk things over. And it's how I just, oh, that's a good idea. Oh, that's a really bad idea. Let's not bring that into the world and act on it. Gosh, I'd really love to jump off the balcony to see if this tree growing beside the building will hold me, but that's probably a bad idea. I'm not going to act on that. So we're constantly creating the world that we live in. It's on a continual basis. It's through our relationships. It's through whether or not we act on the thoughts that we are having in our head in speech. Now, this is going someplace. Just bear with me here for a minute. So throughout history, particularly in the 20th century, probably because it's so well recorded, but throughout history, tyrants have always sought to control speech. Control speech, control the written language. Ultimately, you can control thought. Control the written language, control the speech that is said out loud, as well as the speech that's written down, as well as the speech that's broadcast through modern media. If you can control that, you can eventually control thought. It doesn't take some science fiction device to do that. Think that's far-fetched? Well, I would encourage you to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote in the Gulag Archipelago about how the Soviets were able to control speech, particularly inside of prisons. And it's interesting that speech, the written word specifically, is what got Solzhenitsyn thrown into prison to begin with. But bottom line, those who spoke up got some rather severe treatment. And pretty soon, nobody else is speaking up. And pretty soon, after a few people get killed and other people come back after having been horribly tortured, other people just kind of start to get on board. So Alexander Solzhenitsyn is one example of personal experience that was written down in the 20th century, specifically during the 40s and 50s under the Soviet era, where certainly speech was being controlled. There was absolutely no free speech. Now, okay, let's move forward, or let's move to another area. Let's look at the progressive era in American history. So early 20th century. Now, it certainly started before this. So I'm going to speak very broadly here. Early 20th century, some of you may remember learning about in high school the progressive era. So we're talking about people like Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, later on Theodore, did I say Teddy? Yeah, Teddy, Theodore Roosevelt. And then later on FDR, and even later on, you could certainly make a very, very strong argument that LBJ was progressive. And then, of course, we've seen many since. But here's where I'm going with this. The original progressives, the historical progressives, they rejected the concepts in the founding of the nation. Specifically, they rejected the concept of the sovereignty of the individual. The progressives believed that an individual was born into a society, born into a government, and that the individual was subordinate to those things. They believed that the Constitution, as it was originally founded, was outdated and it needed to be continually updated to keep up with the times. They very much saw it as an impediment to their agenda, which was actually pretty mild by today's standards. Nevertheless, these core ideas to what the progressives, the core ideas of what the progressives had, were and actually continue to be pretty radical. They're not on board with the sovereignty of the individual. Okay, he is subject to the state, and therefore there is no concept of individual rights. And so to me, that's a problem. But a lot of people don't know that, and I didn't know that until fairly recently when I was diving into some of these issues. I did not realize that. Nevertheless, a lot of these ideas have stayed with us through the 20th century, particularly overtly the idea that the Constitution needs to be continually evolving. It's seen as an impediment to an agenda constantly. And there seems to be very little appreciation amongst those who may still call themselves progressives. That's a conversation for another day, because they're not. But there is certainly a view that the Constitution is an impediment, with no appreciation for the fact that, yes, that's exactly how it was written. It was written to slow us down, to make sure that one age, one generation couldn't so radically change things that it was irreparable. So that's a very important thing to understand. Is it an impediment? Absolutely, it's an impediment. That's the way it was designed, was to keep us from being able to move quickly in government, in passing laws, in passing amendments, all those sorts of things. It's a pain in the rear. And that's a whole, and that could be a nice point of departure for the administrative state, because that's one of the ways that we as a people, our government has gotten around the Constitution. Totally different conversation to this. We're focusing on free speech here. And these people did not think that they did not view government as being a threat to the individual, which certainly the founders did. I don't think I've ever read anywhere where somebody's made an argument that the founders did not think government was a threat. Even those who were the strongest federalists, who wanted the stronger federal government, were still very, very concerned about tyranny developing. That's why they had just fought a revolution in the very recent past at the time. So we'll talk a little bit about the modern left, just because this is germane to the conversation on free speech. So these concepts, these progressive concepts of the sovereignty of the individual being subservient to the society and the state, hence no real natural rights. They're derived instead of from our creator, as stated in the Declaration. It comes from the society. It comes from the government. All right, that's the one point. So just observe, hell, just use the last 2 years, but I would go back to about 1995 at how speech has been curtailed in our own country. And I'm not going to get into it. This is not an argument. It's not a debate. It's from my point of view. Often you've observed ideas being suppressed just in the past couple of years, and how open discussion is shut down, how the left largely hijacked language. So remember, with language follows thought. So today, in my view, there's a continual effort to restrict what can be said in public, to restrict what can be broadcasted, amplified, right? To restrict what can be written. And so what we have today is a situation where, at least historically, the very people who state that they are looking out for the little guy are actively working to remove the only thing that those very people really have left, and that's their free thought, their free speech, free thought, and their individual sovereignty. So I'll just go on to say that free debate's essential. It can be hard, it can be difficult, it can be heartbreaking, it can be brutal. But the big but is, yeah, it may be unpleasant. Oh, believe me, I have conversations with my wife that are very unpleasant. We all have those conversations. Oh, hopefully we have those conversations. But without free debate, free exchange of thought, free exchange of speech, we certainly would not have a modern civilization. Think about all the engineers and inventors and philosophers who had to be able to say what they wanted to say, despite the fact that it may have offended another person or another group. What if they had been silenced? What if Nietzsche had been silenced? What if Jesus had been silenced? What if FDR had been silenced? Or Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson? What if they had been silenced? What if the people who did the engineering to, send a man to the moon, what if they had been silenced and we're not allowed to exchange free ideas? So yes, sometimes free speech is a difficult thing. It can be difficult. It can be hard. It can be very hard to hear something that is contrary to perhaps the way that you viewed the world your entire life. Nevertheless, if we listen, oftentimes we will find, even if we don't agree with the other person at the end of the day, we may find that we learned something very important. Not the least of which would be their sovereign individuality. I can't say that word. Their sovereign individuality and their humanity. So I'm going to leave with sovereign speech is the fundamental thing to being a sovereign individual. Why in the world would we curtail it? There are people who legitimately believe that the individual should not be sovereign. That's fine. We can have that debate, but we'll do it through free speech. So I'll leave you with, we create the world that we live in through our speech, through our free speech. And so what kind of world are we going to build with it? What kind of world are each of us going to choose to create with our speech? And that's what I'm going to leave you with tonight. I will see you later. Thank you for joining. Thank you. Bye.